Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to B4 Live. I'm Richard Rosser from B4, and today we have Kevin Poulter from Freeze. Kevin, are you there?
I am here. Here we go. Look at this. As if by
Fantastic.
magic.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Thanks, Kevin. Not too bad. Busy?
Yes. No, always time for B4 though.
Oh, bless you. That's very sweet of you. Did Stuart make you say that? Yeah.
My arm's firmly behind my back.
Excellent. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Kevin doesn't have a presentation as such, so it's really a case of taking questions from the floor. We've got a few built up from people that have sent them in advance of the talk, but if anybody would like to come on screen and ask Kevin a burning question that they've got that they'd like an answer to, please do so. You just put your name in the chat box. Say, I've got a question. I'll start off with a question that we've got in the bank, but if you want to put a question in the chat box, I'd like to come on screen or can ask on your behalf, then please do so. So one question that we had in, Kevin, was what contact can I have with furloughed staff? Some are asking to be kept updated. Some have just gone quiet. If I'm updating them about work-related issues rather than their employment, could this be deemed that they are working, in inverted commas? If I only update those who have asked to be kept in touch, where does that leave the others on return to work? Any guidance, please?
It's a good question. And so let me just go back a little step. I'm sure everybody knows by now what furlough is, but this is part of the coronavirus job retention scheme introduced by the government on the 20th of March. And it is really to, as we know, avoid people being dismissed, made redundant, laid off or other things. And the plan is to try and avoid as many people going to universal credit as I think possible. So it's just for those, and the easy examples are really shops, restaurants, bars, people who've been forced to close, and for those employees who just simply can't work. So setting them aside, what they can do is to put them out really at arm's length, as long as they're not doing work. And what does work mean? Well, it's about generating any revenues for a business. Well, if you're closed, pretty straightforward. But for continuing businesses who are just choosing to furlough any number of employees during this time, then it's slightly more of a challenge, because you may well have some people still working, you may still have a business to operate and to run. How do you stay in touch with those people who have been furloughed, whilst also sort of maintaining a business, keeping them as part of the employee collective, and not sort of leaving them out to their own devices for too much? Well, it's a real challenge, and different businesses, different organizations will look at these things in different ways. The most strict and perhaps the most safe view is to just not contact people at all in relation to work things, and certainly not contact them through their work email if you have access to phone numbers, personal emails, just to simply avoid any suggestion by HMRC, by the government, that they are doing any sort of work. Now, again, I understand that that's not practical for a lot of organizations. So limiting and being clear, absolutely clear with employees that they shouldn't be doing anything which would typically be considered work. Just before we started, we had a little conversation about whether things like marketing can take place, whether you can even just respond to emails that have come in without sort of taking them any further forward, even if it's to say, we're not here right now. Again, all of those things, if it's providing any sort of service, any sort of benefit to the company, to the business, my view would be, and we've got to acknowledge that there's still a lot of uncertainty around this for the time being, but my view would be that that could be considered work, it could be deemed work, and far safer not to be doing that than to do it. I know that doesn't work for everyone, but it's interesting to know that HMRC have set up a hotline for reporting, typically by employees or others, bosses, companies who are furloughing staff and at the same time asking them to leave. Clearly that's a fraud on the benefit that's being received by companies, a fraud on the government, and clearly by setting up this hotline, HMRC is saying we just won't tolerate that. So it's a very fine line. The best thing you can do is to be absolutely clear with employees they can't work.
I mean, it's just a contradiction to the business continuity thing, isn't it? I mean, if I'm emailing a supplier and I don't get a response, I'll go to a different supplier.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you.
And it doesn't bode well for them when they come out of this.
And there's a lot of talk about sort of the sort of opening the floodgates again, getting us back to business, seeing some sort of boom and saving these businesses. And if there's no business left to save, then how do you do it? Well, the answer is you have to keep somebody off furlough, keep somebody running the business. And sometimes, particularly for smaller businesses, that person is a director. Or a number of directors. And there are particular rules around that as well. And a director can furlough themselves or be furloughed by the company, but they can only carry out statutory duties. Now, again, there's some debate, some discussion around what that might be, but carrying out things which are attending board meetings, as an example, sort of contacting with a company's house. But one of the overriding duties of a director is really to act in the best interest of the business. Now, that isn't usually ignoring your clients or your customers, it's responding to them. So there's, again, a lot of discussion to be had around it, but to err on the side of caution, if you feel the need to do some work, or that somebody that you have who would otherwise be working, you can't quite do without them entirely, then either give their work to somebody else or don't furlough them, look at other means. And one of those options might be looking at reduced pay, reduced hours, or even alternating people through furlough, as long as it's for a minimum period of 3 weeks at a time. So in a minimum of 3 week blocks, you can put somebody out on furlough, but potentially, if you choose to, and they agree to, bring them back and whilst furloughing somebody else. And the key there is that you can't automatically furlough an employee. They have to agree to be furloughed. And that agreement should, and certainly the guidance is, and the recommendation that is in writing, and that a record of that agreement is retained for 5 years, suggesting to me that HMRC might spend not time immediately going back and back checking all of these things, but doing it over the next few years.
Excellent. Another question we've got, Kevin. If staff go off sick when furloughed, is this reported, managed in the usual way? Does SSP kick in?
Oh, again, these are challenging questions. Furlough and SSP can't run together at the same time. So that's I think the starting point. You can't do both. There are two ways of looking at it. If you're an employee who's furloughed and potentially receiving 80% of their pay or more, what's the sort of obligation on the employee to report that they're sick and potentially then reduce their pay down to only statutory sick pay provisions, and unless there's some other sort of company sick pay in place. But as a company, as a business, you want to know when your employees are fit and well, because although we know that the furlough scheme has been extended to the 30th of June, what we don't know is whether you want to bring people back from furlough at short notice. And that's within a company's right to do that. Certainly make sure that's in the letters that are being sent. So that fine line between having your employees feeling able and confident and like they should be reporting these things, whilst also this strange dilemma where they potentially also reduce their pay quite significantly down to only statutory sick pay levels, which are only sort of £95 or so. So that's a challenge for all businesses. But what we know for certain is that you can't claim both SSP and furlough at the same time.
Okay, excellent. We've got a few questions in the pipeline that I'll ask on people's behalf. But if you do have something you'd like to put to Kevin, please do put it in the chat box. So that's, if you're not familiar with Zoom, that's at the bottom to the right-hand side or left-hand side of your share screen, the green button, and put the chat in there. Either use the drop down, put it to me, so I'm B4 Live host, or put it to everybody so everybody can see your question. Next question we've got, Kevin, is sort of along the lines of redundancy. So two elements to it. Can you make staff redundant while on furlough or wait until they return to work? And furloughed staff, does the same notice period remain in place if they want to leave their employment?
Okay, I'm going to start with the second one because it's probably an easier one, that all employment terms and conditions continue aside from those which are specific to furlough or to any changes that have been brought around. So notice provisions, notice periods will continue as normal. And so that's a relatively straightforward answer. In terms of the first one, can you make people redundant whilst on furlough? Well, there's no suggestion that you can't. Of course, there are, as well as the legal aspects of this, there are the sort of ethical aspects. And I know some organisations have taken the view that whilst the furlough period is operating, whilst we're running through to the 30th of June, no preemptive decisions might be taken. That's down to the company. It doesn't stop an organisation though from doing that, and it's slightly difficult at the moment because we're in an open-ended period. There is still a potential for the retention scheme to be extended beyond the 30th of June. Who knows? This might depend on how much money is left in the bank, but there's still a potential for that. Making decisions now in anticipation of what might or might not happen in the future, it is always going to be difficult for an organization to manage, unless it's unrelated, certainly to the coronavirus. Those businesses that are potentially in lifestyle, in culture, there's possibly an expectation that it's not going to be, let's say the 1st of July, we're not going to be back to where we were. And I think that's probably a fair and widely shared view. So there's talk, and I know that the government's in discussions at the moment about potentially sort of scaling down the furlough scheme whilst business ramps up and scales back up itself. We don't know what's going to happen yet, but certainly you're not prevented from considering what might happen in the future and taking precautionary steps, whether that's reducing the workforce, looking at restructuring perhaps, whilst the retention scheme is open. And one thing to add there is in relation to that communication with employees during furlough. We don't see that there's any reason why you can't consult with employees about redundancy, speak with employees about redundancy, as long as it's not, again, generating work for the business, which by essence it's not. It's quite the opposite. So you can communicate, you can stay in touch, you can conduct a redundancy consultation process, and you can even, we believe, commence a notice period during the furlough period as well. So for businesses that do have concerns about what things might look like at the moment on the 1st of July, they can take preemptive steps to prepare for that, to plan for that, and may even have reduced their workforce already, potentially even substantially, by the time the furlough scheme does come to an end.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. Very comprehensive. So we've got a few questions now coming through. For those who have a career in sales and have been furloughed, how is their pay calculated? Is it just 80% of basic salary or 80% of average salary based on a previous tax year? So I presume, I'm not sure if the implication there is that there might be a basic plus commission of some sort of relevant to the sales position.
Yeah, there's a bit of an accountancy question there as well, so I'll dodge those bits. But there's been, again, even confusion around this. Initially, we were talking about the 28th of February as being the sort of the date, the cutoff date when people had to be on a payroll, and the salary that they were receiving on that date was typically the salary that was used. Only in the last week has that been extended to the 19th of March. So people who are now on the payroll on the 19th of March will also be included in the scheme. And the new date that their salary would be reviewed or their pay would be reviewed would be the 19th of March. Now, if anyone has done it already, preempted it on the 28th of February, then for the first review, at least for the first payment through the portal, that will be allowed. But going forward, the 19th of March will be the date. And for people who are salaried, it's relatively straightforward. What your pay was then is the date, is the amount, that will be calculated by HMRC. And it's 80% of that up to a maximum cap of £2,500. For people who have variable payments, it becomes much more difficult. And only the recent guidance, again, has been updated to suggest that anything which is variable month to month really shouldn't be included. So things like commission might not necessarily automatically be included. Now, I would suggest that if there's any questions around that, you speak to your payroll providers, you speak to potentially even an accountant, or speak to a lawyer who can unscramble that, because I don't want to give any specific advice, because every employment is different, everyone is paid on different ways, or can be. There is some more clarity around the casual workers, so people on 0 hours contracts or even seasonal workers, who, rather than necessarily taking that date on now the 19th of March or the 28th of February, you can take an average over the month, sort of monthly average over the past 12 months, or alternatively, and this might be particularly appropriate for seasonal workers, to take a figure which is the previous year's, so the month the previous year. So does that make some sense? So if we're, I don't know, think of an example. If you're working in a clothes shop on a 0 hours contract, it might be that you do more work in the sales periods than you would otherwise during a normal shopping time. So following Easter, it might be that during the Easter month, you would get additional work, you would have done additional hours to cover that additional demand. You can take sort of April last year's pay as being what you would receive this year, rather than taking an average over the full 12 months. Was that a slightly convoluted answer?
Well, I'm sure our questionnaire, well, the person that asked the question.
Yeah, come back and ask for clarity on that one.
That wasn't clear enough. And in regards to questions, thanks for that, Kevin. If you put a question, I appreciate this is a sensitive subject, so maybe a lot of you don't really want to come on screen and ask direct, but unless you say you'd like to ask the question, I'll ask it on your behalf. So rather than keep asking whenever anybody puts a question. Right, next one we have. Kevin, you say that an employee has to agree to be furloughed. What's the position if they don't agree?
Yeah, and another one that I'm receiving a lot of queries about. There was a general assumption that most people would prefer to be furloughed at the moment, rather than risk then losing their jobs. And it's got to be said that that still, for many organizations, remains a significant risk and possibility. I think gentle persuasion is a good way to start. Explaining people, and I always say this, that communicating, being as open and honest with employees as possible, as commercially reasonable as well, that it is always the best thing to do. Explain to them the real situation here, that if there is no work for them to do, then by definition, their role might be redundant, albeit with a small r. There's no work for them to do. And if they don't agree to the furlough, the only alternative may be that there's a dismissal. The challenge, of course, for businesses, if that's one person out of 20 doing a particular job, is it automatically fair for them who are objecting to be dismissed? And the answer is no. You might still have to go through a fair redundancy process if you are looking to make any dismissals. Simply by somebody refusing to be furloughed isn't in itself a reason for dismissal. So be persuasive, try and get as much across as possible to explain that position. And one alternative may be to look at reducing hours and similarly reducing pay. If somebody's been there for under 2 years, then as long as we're not discriminating against them on one of the grounds of protected characteristics, which this obviously wouldn't be, at least on the face of it, then it may be that you can dismiss them on notice in any event, prior to them receiving any rights for unfair dismissal after that 2-year period. So there are different ways of looking at it. If all else fails, and it's really about cost savings, then looking at dismissing them and offering them new terms, or offering them terms on a furlough scheme. Now, it's a little bit messy, I won't lie. It's not something I would advise. You still have to go through a notice period. But for the time being, persuasiveness and being open and honest, I think, is as best as you can probably do. But dangerous to dismiss anybody simply for refusing to be furloughed. It's still a right that has to be agreed by the employee, and it's effectively a breach of their terms of employment, a breach of contract, if you were to force it upon them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kevin. I've got three more in the pipeline, but if anybody else wants to put a question through to Kevin, please do so now. Sort of conscious of time that we're rapidly getting towards 12:30. A quick one, I think, Kevin, more on a sort of point of housekeeping, really. If you are paying furloughed staff 80%, do you need to change their contract to reflect this, or is the letter enough?
Well, the letter in itself will probably be considered a variation to the terms of employment, their contract, albeit on at the moment, uncertain temporary period. So having a letter which is prepared in the right way, and if anyone has any questions about that, do contact me separately. But a letter which explains to them quite clearly what the purpose of the furlough is, the reason for it, and how it actually impacts on them is really important. And this written response or acknowledgement or agreement to it, my view is we're not in a situation at the moment where the post's operating particularly efficiently, or they're doing a great job, that people don't have access to scanned signatures and things. An email response, an email acceptance will generally be considered enough. Keep hold of it again up to 5 years, but making sure that they are aware and clear on what they're agreeing to is hopefully, and we expect, will be sufficient. But it is a variation to their terms. For people who are looking at sort of longer term changes, then the same rules apply. If you're looking to vary somebody's contract on a permanent basis, either by reducing their hours, reducing their pay, which is also another point, either during the furlough period or potentially even after the end of the furlough period, when that comes to an end, and bringing people back, then the obligations around fair consultation still apply. Trying to get this agreement through on an individual basis, again, for small businesses particularly, might be easier, but don't be caught out. All employment rules still apply. There's no excuses. There are no shortcuts right now. There may in the future be a slightly relaxed approach taken by the tribunals, particularly at this time, but we can't be guaranteed of that. We can't be certain of that. So take advice, do what you would normally do, follow your own policies and procedures, and be a responsible and good employer.
It's a bit naive of me to think there would be a quick answer to that question, wasn't it?
Sorry.
No, it's brilliant. No, they're good. They're good stuff.
I charge by the 6 minutes, so I need to keep moving.
Brilliant. Obviously, PPE is a hot topic. We've got a question. Frontline staff refusing or are reluctant to do face-to-face work with the best possible protection in place. What sort of advice would you give in that particular scenario, Kevin?
Again, another challenge, and one that many organisations are facing, one I'm getting a lot of questions about. Is health and safety, and we've probably heard a lot about health and safety over the last few weeks. The laws still apply. You have to provide a safe place of work. Now, that only goes to a limited extent. It has to be reasonable. What we're not expecting people to do is to sort of build sort of lead rooms or anything like this to try and keep a virus stray. But PPE is essential for those people coming into close contact. We've seen what people are wearing on the front line in the NHS. They're fully suited and booted. People don't have access to that, and you wouldn't necessarily expect that working in, I don't know, an off license, which is still open. But if anyone's been to the supermarket recently, they'll have seen glass screens being built up around. The staff are provided with protective equipment, so whether that's gloves, whether that's masks, other screening equipment. So taking steps to protect employees is always going to be important. But there are limits, and it's up to, again, employers to explain what they're doing, to be convincing, to be encouraging. And if you need somebody to attend the office, there is a reason why the government haven't gone so far as to stop people going to work, and many of us have noticed sort of the lack of that particular direction. We still want to keep the world running. We need to keep the country running. And if your role is part of that, or you can't simply work from home, you should be going to work as a starting point, so long as the employer is taking reasonable steps to protect you. So it's, again, not necessarily straightforward answer. It depends on the type of place you're working. And if anyone's watching the BBC news for the updates every time, you'll notice how spread out the usually packed media room is. Keeping space between desks, keeping space between machinery, keeping people at home as much as possible is always going to be the starting point.
Brilliant. Just got a couple of questions, Kevin, on how you see what do you see happening in the employment market when the government's job retention scheme ends after it's run its 4 months, and which industries do you see being most impacted?
Gosh, well, I've already mentioned a couple of those people working in sort of the cultural industries and hospitality. I think are obviously going to be struggling even when we get back up and running. Those working in the event space, I know B4 have got a lot of interest in there as well. So that's going to be a real challenge, particularly if global travel restrictions continue to apply. I would expect the travel industry is again going to be one of those things which is slow to build up, simply because there's going to be a natural resistance or fear about travel, perhaps. I might be proved wrong. Everyone might be so desperate to get out of the country or out of their own homes that there's a huge boom, but we'll have to wait and see. But as I mentioned, a lot of organizations, I think, will have this slow build up, almost like starting from scratch. And that's probably going to be true of pubs and restaurants. It's probably going to be true of theaters and cinemas, possibly even gyms. This slow build up from a standing start, which many organizations and businesses are right now, is going to be a huge issue. And I think even people like me who work from home now, it's not something I've done before. And I think that people are falling into, reasonably quickly actually, some comfort, some familiarity, a bit of a habit, a bit of a routine working from home. And I think encouraging people to go back into an office may prove to be a challenge. People can request and apply for flexible working as a matter of law. There's a duty on an employer to consider it, and really only reject it if it's not possible to do that. Well, I think what this has done is really proven to many non-believers that home working isn't as just an excuse to sit back and watch B4 webinars and Loose Women. It's an opportunity to actually get some work done in a way which is still productive, still practical. You're still able to engage with team members, albeit in a different way. I think we're expecting a bit of a workplace revolution, and that probably applies to all of us.
How very dare you put us in the same bracket as Loose Women? It's almost libelous, that is. Thank you, Kevin. Just one to really round off. Thoughts about the future, what happens next, what we should all be thinking about. Obviously, it's a big question, but maybe just to round off on that particular note.
Yeah, no, I think unfortunately, I'm going to briefly repeat what I've just said. I think start now to think about what that new world will look like. Start to think about whether you will be back up to 100% of strength immediately, or if it's going to be a challenge to get us even back to where we were. So take that time now. Think about it now. Use the time that we have, this sort of period of grace for many businesses during the furlough period, during the retention scheme, to take stock, to think about that, to look at maybe the structure of your business, how you're operating, if you can do things in a different way. And it's an unfortunate outcome that many people really will still consider that there are redundancies at the end of this. It's not certainly any way of guaranteed avoidance, sadly.
Fantastic. I really appreciate your time and
no problem.
Responses, and hopefully we'll get you back again soon.
Yeah, thank you. And what can I just add that at Freeth we are keeping hold of a coronavirus updated retention web pages. So do have a look at that if you can. I'm sure the link will be available. But that's keeping updated, and it's across sort of all aspects of the business. And I think certainly I'm being told is proving useful for many people who do have questions. Otherwise, just get in touch.
Brilliant. Well, if you can whiz your details over to Lorna, we'll get that out to
Absolutely.
with a copy of the video. later on today. Brilliant. Thank you
Great.
very much, Kevin. And just to finish off before we sign off, everybody, thank you again for all your time. Just very briefly, for those of you not aware, we've got the community support pages where we'll include things, as Kevin just referred to, from B4 members in there on a daily basis. We've got the B4 membership trial, so anybody that's not a member that would like to take advantage of B4 membership for the next 90 days, free, no obligation, please do so. That ends at the end of April, so please do click on and sign up for that, either as an individual or as a company. B4 Lives, there's a separate page on B4 Lives. So tomorrow we've got Alan, who's with us today, I think, Alan. So he'll be talking tomorrow on behalf of Whitley Stimpson. Register at the link provided. And then if you scroll further down the page, we've got a lot of talks coming up. You can see videos, so Kevin's video will be there later on this afternoon. And you've got to catch up with all the other videos, webinars that we've had in the past. Tomorrow, we've got Alan Morgan from Whitley Stimpson tomorrow on the coronavirus business interruption scheme. We've got Arjun and Anissa Kaker tomorrow afternoon, live from Atlanta. So that should be an interesting talk. Have a look on the website to find out about Arjun, who's formerly of Foster & Partners, and Anissa, who runs Anissa International, one of the world's leading makeup brush manufacturers, and to find out about her story. And that's it. But thank you again to Kevin and to everybody for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.